All right. Why me? Well, it's 2:00, and as I'm Michael Gropper. I'm the department chair for 10 years, and I came to the department. I'll talk a little bit more about it later. I came as an intern in 1989 and then an anesthesia resident starting in 1990, and I've been here ever since. Thank you all for coming. We have people from all around the country, all around the world. I think Lars Eriksson gets the prize for coming from Stockholm, which I think was the longest distance. And we're all here to honor Ron Miller. I suppose when I became chair, I didn't think that these types of events were necessarily something that was going to be my job, but I inherited a department that had some of the true greats in our specialty. And I've had the honor of honoring Bill Hamilton, Ted Eager, John Severinghouse, and now Ron Miller. So if you think about the history of our specialty, there's really no department in the country or the world that has that kind of legacy. And this is perhaps one of the most important. Perhaps Ron wasn't of the same scientific pedigree of the others that we talked about, but he deserves much of the credit for ensuring success of all those people. And certainly, as I'll talk about in a moment, for ensuring my own success. So we have a number of tributes from different people, as you can see in the program, and we have programs for you. We also have a book that you can sign outside, copies of the textbook and some other things that you can see in the back. We'll have a break where you can catch up with people, and then finishing around 5 o'clock, then we'll have a reception in the lobby here from 5 to 7, where again, you'll be able to mingle a bit more. And I think some of our residents and other faculty who are trapped in the operating room at the moment will be able to join us. So I think I was first on the program, but I think it makes much more sense to have Ron's daughter, Shelley Mitchell, come and start and talk about her remembrances of Ron. I've known Shelley since she was a new grad nurse in the ICU at Parnassus, which is probably in the very early 90s. Is that about right? Early 90s, good. And she was an amazing ICU nurse and then went on to get her CRNA training and has been at San Francisco General since then. So I'm going to start with Shelley.
Thank you, Michael. My sister Laura and I are profoundly touched and grateful to see so many friends and colleagues come together to celebrate the life of our father. And to begin with, our dad was so proud of his only grandchild, my sister Laura, daughter Ella. Ella is unable to be with us today because she is just halfway through her 2-year Peace Corps service commitment in southern Senegal. So she's remiss that she cannot be here. When I think about my dad, oh, he's so complicated, but so simple. He was completely ordinary, yet extraordinary, like all wrapped up in this bizarre little package. He was Dr. Miller, he was Ron, Ronnie, RDM, Ronald, hey Anesthesia, hey are you the E1? But he was also a father and a son. And to my sister Laura and I, he was just dad. And our father, as many of you know, was born in Indiana and grew up the son of a Studebaker factory worker in South Bend. In childhood, my dad was a very average student. His mother saved everything, including his hair clippings, his baby teeth, and yes, his report cards. So I scoured through his report cards and there were a lot of B's, a lot of C's, and some D's, and I did see an F. And at the same time, my grandfather was a professional musician and they pushed my dad towards music, towards sports. And then I think my grandmother decided that he needed a little bit more. So she introduced him to golf. She said at an early age, our dad worked as a caddy from like age, early, as a caddy at the urging of his mother. And it was on the golf course where he made connections and met some physicians. And then that on the fairway was where the idea of becoming a doctor came to be. After that, after that time, he became more focused on good grades. I could see his report cards were going up. He was awarded this like a $500 Studebaker Union World War II scholarship, which at that time, $500 was a lot of money. And at that time, he joined the debate team. He became a skilled negotiator and debater, which many of you have been on the other side of. His team won the Indiana State Championship, and he was always very proud of that, even as an adult. And now for Laura and I growing up, the fact that Dad was such a skilled negotiator, had such keen debate skills as a teenage girl, that was a real bummer for me. We couldn't get anything done. So how was our dad as a father? He was strict and he was frugal, but he was a prankster. I would say in public, he was not outwardly affectionate, but he loved playing practical jokes, and his little snicker afterwards, that crooked little smile. And I know he loved us very much. For a long time, I thought that my sister and I were actually his second kids, because his firstborn kids were the residents in the anesthesia department at UCSF. After a while, I saw some, imperfections in my dad, and that allowed me to actually be closer with him. And we became friends. He decided to sit us down and prioritize education and critical thinking with my sister and I, and always the importance of travel and always remaining curious. While my dad was researching neuromuscular blockers in the 1970s, he took the family to Holland, which back before the days of cell phones and the internet, Holland really was like another world. Then in high school, 5 years later, my high school Spanish class was going to take a trip to Oaxaca, and I sort of glossed over it, and he insisted, this was in 1983, that I go with my Spanish class down to Oaxaca, Mexico, which at the time was quite untraveled. And it was on that trip that I fell in love with the Latin American culture, which has sort of helped shape who I am today. And when I declared my major in college, it was Spanish literature, and I was so sure he was going to be disappointed in me, that he was going to think it was a terrible waste of time. And so it took me a while to tell him, but much to my surprise, my dad pointed out to me that studying literature and art gives you an unparalleled opportunity to hone the skills of analysis. When you read, you get to put on somebody else's shoes, and you get to spend time in the mind of the author or the artist. You get an opportunity to evaluate a point of view that may challenge your own. And he advised me to be grateful for those challenges. I was, and I still am. I took these skills with me when I became a nurse in the early 1990s, and they've made me a more compassionate and empathetic nurse anesthetist. I didn't tell my dad that I was applying to CRNA training programs. As you know, most of you know, he wasn't always a huge fan. Until I was accepted into a program and I was starting the next week. I said, Dad, I'm going to school next week to become a CRNA. And his response was, well, I suppose if I were in your shoes, I would think that would be a good career move too. And so that's what I got. So moving on, my dad remarried in 1988 to a woman, and it became clear to my sister Laura and I that travel was inconvenient for her, for his new wife. So Laura and I learned and had the opportunity to become my dad's +1 on many of his business trips. I mean, how many young women can say they get to travel the world with their father? We're so lucky. We went to Holland, Germany, France, Belgium, Spain, Hungary, Mexico, Chile, Ecuador, Argentina, Panama, Hong Kong, Sweden, Denmark, China, Taiwan, Japan, so many more. Our father showed my sister Laura and I the world. He really did. And we are grateful beyond words. And Dad, I promise to read more books. I promise to remain curious, to travel, to use the compassionate nature that you brought out in me to do good into the world. And I also want to acknowledge my husband, Andrew, and Laura's partner, Chris, for being with us and supporting us during these final difficult years of my father's life. And my friends, Tiffany, Gail, Shannon, and Tracy, who were incredibly supportive and loving to Laura and I as we cared for our father in the most loving, respectful way that we could. And finally, there are too many of you to thank. To each person in the department, the UCSF Department of Anesthesia, that had a role in hosting this memorial symposium for our dad. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, I want to talk a little bit about my experience with Ron. And, you know, I've had some time to reflect on it and reflect on the influence that he had on me. And I don't think you necessarily realize it at the time, but over the 10 years or so that I've been chair, I think a lot of the way I approach things and how I think about the job was absolutely formed by Ron. So I just have some pictures to show of him, and I wrote down some remembrances that I had as I thought about what I would talk about today. So, you know, you've probably seen this picture. This is actually a picture of Ron when he was a resident, and he had come here from Indiana to do a residency in anesthesia. And you can see him here with Stuart Cullen, who was the founding department chair. And just by way of history, Stuart Cullen came in 1958. And I think laid a foundation because Cullen was invited to come here by Julius Comroe, who started the Cardiovascular Research Institute. And Cullen said, well, I'll consider it, came from Iowa, but only if anesthesia is its own department. So in those days, most anesthesia departments were actually divisions of the Department of Surgery. I think something that, I mean, most surgeons wish it was still true. But that was very important because I think Cullen recognized the importance of anesthesia being its own specialty. And, you know, he was the inaugural chair, followed by Hamilton, and then for over 25 years by Ron. Ron also fancied himself a regional anesthesiologist. He's one of the first people that really studied the anatomy that was necessary to be able to do nerve blocks, which was not all that popular in those days. And you can see that he took an interest with that here. And it looks like he's showing it to Cullen more than Cullen showing it to him, but that wouldn't surprise me. But I think Ron's time in Vietnam was really foundational. And you're going to hear from Mike Rosenthal later. They were both in the military at the same time. You can see Ron here. It's a very serious looking right here. And he told a lot of stories about Vietnam. In fact, I was talking to Manny Pardo the other day. He said he actually had an artillery shell in his office. I don't know. Do you have that, Shelley? You don't? Yeah, I should check if it's live still. Yes. But and clearly this was foundational for Ron. And I think I really like what Shelley said. I mean, I guess one of the characteristics I shared with Ron, I was a pretty mediocre student. So I definitely had my B's and C's. I don't know if I had any D's, but I was a mediocre student who didn't get into medical school the first time that he applied. Maybe that was part of our bond. But you may not know that when, you know, Ron, this was in the late 1960s, and he knew he was going to be drafted, and he was now an anesthesiologist and just finished his training. So he actually went to the Department of Defense and said, listen, can you assign me or station me in Da Nang in the field hospital there? And the reason was because not only did he want to do anesthesia, but he had a growing interest in transfusion medicine. And in fact, in his time in Da Nang, was really one of the first people to describe massive transfusion, the coagulopathy that's associated with massive transfusion. And actually, you know, I spent most of my career studying acute respiratory distress syndrome, which initially was called Da Nang lung. So this was, Vietnam was the first war where soldiers could be rapidly evacuated to a hospital Prior to that, because there were helicopters and it was a small country, so you could pick up somebody severely wounded in 15 or 20 minutes, perhaps, get them to a real hospital, and they could be operated on there. He has some sort of gruesome photographs that I'll spare you. I think Manny knows what I'm talking about. But I think one of the great memories I have of Ron was traveling to Vietnam with him and to a meeting in Hanoi. And they had a dinner reception there. And we met a woman who was an anesthesiologist in the North Vietnamese army. And they apparently had tunnels throughout the Da Nang, underneath the Da Nang hospital. And she talked about how they used to listen in to the conversations in the operating room. And they actually would learn from some of the talks and things. And then she recognized Ron Miller's voice. That was a pretty amazing experience to be in Hanoi with him at that time. It clearly was foundational for him because he actually was able to start some of his research there. So thinking about that, thinking about being assigned in the military to a place where you can do research tells you something about his deep commitment to academic anesthesiology. I think a lot of people will show you this, but he came back to a department that was obviously mostly white, mostly male, and there he is in the back. You know, some of the big names you can see here, and I won't name them all, but of course you see Stuart Cullen, John Severinghouse, and others, Ted Eager. This was really a incredibly fertile environment. If you think about it, George Gregory, George and Ron were in residence together, correct? Yeah, I mean, what an amazing environment to be in if you're interested in academic anesthesiology, these spectacular intellects. And so no doubt he was primed for success. But as Shelley pointed out, I mean, here's a pretty conservative guy from the Midwest coming to San Francisco during the Summer of Love. And you know, I just, that's such a great contrast. You can see now his hair is getting a little longer. I couldn't find the picture with the really much longer sideburns, which were popular in those days. But I think that also speaks to Ron, who clearly, you know, leaned conservative, at least for San Francisco, leaned conservative, but welcomed everybody. And I think that's something that I guess we could all learn a lesson about today. He had a very diverse department. He did have, actually, the first professor in our department was a woman. He recruited a diverse group of people to come to that department before diversity was really a word. And he welcomed everyone. And I think, you know, he, you know, arms would be open. You can see, as I said, the Summer of Love here. Heady times in San Francisco, for sure. And I think that probably contributed somewhat to his success later on. So when I was studying for my PhD here with John Clements and Norman Staub, I was always told, don't waste your time writing a book chapter. That's a waste of your time. Don't do it. And I always thought, well, okay, but I was starting in my residency in anesthesia, and I knew there was a book, this Miller Anesthesia book, which was viewed as really the Bible, if you will, of our specialty. And certainly that book has benefited the department tremendously. And I was really honored when Ron asked me to take over after doing 8 editions of the textbook to take over the editorship of that book. And it's a heavy weight. For those of you that travel around the world, I've had the opportunity, I recall being in Africa and India and China, and you go visit a hospital and will have some usually outdated version of the textbook. In China, the most disturbing was a pirated PDF version of the textbook that was in a stack, but nevertheless. And so it's foundational, I think, really to anyone in anesthesia. And I remember him telling me that when the Barish textbook came out, which was probably after 3 or 4 editions of the Miller textbook, it actually outsold the Miller textbook, and there was some panic among the publisher. It's now Elsevier than it was. I don't know what the name of it was. Neal would remember, but whatever they were. And I'll tell you why, because I think at that point, the Miller textbook had now grown to 3 volumes, heavy reading. And I know that the editorial people at the publisher said, you know, I think we're falling behind. This new Barish textbook, which is much more concise and it's easier reading, is selling better than your book. And Ron had the wisdom to say, no, this is going to be the deep dive for our specialty. No one else is doing the deep dive. We're going to continue doing that. And what a wise decision he made. understanding that really knowing the foundational aspects of our specialty is going to be crucial to excellence. And it is interesting now to work with the residents who don't carry around the textbook. They have a little thing, a smartphone in their hand. I'm not sure they're even looking at the Miller electronic version. But nevertheless, I think to this day, I think internationally especially, it is respected for that. And you're going to hear from Neal Cohen and Lars Eriksson, who serve as co-editors of that book. On a lighter side, literally, we used to call the Miller Basics Miller Light. And Manny Pardo is the editor-in-chief of the Miller Basics. And then, of course, we called the other anesthesia textbook Miller Dry, for all the reasons that you can imagine. And Manny reminded me that when the residents are supposed to go study, they call it Miller time. So I'm not sure if they actually go read the book, but nevertheless, this is such an important part of our department. And I think keeping that associated with our department is critical. Yes, we have authors from around the world, but it really, I think, has done tremendous help for our department and the reputation of our department. And we're very proud of that. And I think that's really essential to what we do. As Shelley mentioned, he was a talented musician. He belonged to the Bohemian Club, which is a private club in San Francisco of some repute. I won't say what it is. They have a retreat where they go up along the Russian River. It's all very secretive, and captains of industry are there, and they frolic in the woods. I don't really know what they do. I haven't never been there. But, and mostly they're very powerful, very wealthy men. And Ron always insisted that he was only a member because of his piano playing skills. I think there's probably a little more to it than that, but he was a great musician. And here you can see him with another dear faculty member that we lost, Bill Young, who was also a very accomplished musician, particularly as a jazz musician. So music was really important, and I think reflects what Shelley had said about really, having broad interests and many of the skill sets that I'd like to think cross over between being a musician and being a physician. I couldn't resist putting this picture in because here's George Gregory, who we actually were able to celebrate just a couple of months ago with our inaugural George Gregory lecture. You can see him here also with Bill Hickey standing at the front desk. And so whoever decided they should take a picture was saluted by George, as I would hope he would do. And I think for those of us that were residents or even faculty, we really admired Ron's work ethic, and something that I've tried to emulate. He took overnight call, and it was difficult. He also would run the board, what we call the E1. Now, I think many of us thought that was a bit of a mixed blessing, because when Ron would run the board, everybody would run away. So, for example, the surgical cases that maybe have had questionable urgency, the surgeons had learned that just wait till he goes away at 5 o'clock, and then when the night person comes, we'll all run and try to book those cases. When he would make the schedule, as we did every day on this printout of paper, just believe me, if you were in OR 20 on Monday, you were going to be in OR 20 on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, because he would sort of copy forward from the day before. But nevertheless, I think one of the many lessons I learned from him was you must be present in the operating room. And it was very difficult for me, who had made my really whole career and my research career in the intensive care unit. When I became chair, I sort of recognized that. I mean, the operating room is the core of what we do as anesthesiologists. And so I spend one day a week in the operating room, and I love it. I have a great time. But I had to make the difficult choice of giving up the intensive care unit, because the only people who can do anesthesia are anesthetists, and there are others that do critical care. So that was an important lesson for me. So I think there's no doubt that I would not, there's no question I would not be standing here if it were not for Ron's mentorship. I would meet with him once a month to talk about various aspects of critical care, but he would then go on about various things. One of his favorite expressions being, well, I really shouldn't talk about this, but. And there was some scuttlebutt from the School of Medicine or the hospital or whatever it was. And I learned a lot from the stuff that he wasn't supposed to be talking about. And things like, well, if the hospital calls you for a meeting, Find out who's there, and you have to show up with at least as many people as they're going to have there. So don't get outnumbered by them. I think that's good advice. But some things have changed. You know, we now have about 330 faculty, and we're a really big department, over about 750 people. And you know, he was able to know everyone. I don't really know everyone. And I remember one of the things that he always said he was so proud of is he said, you know, I'm really proud of the fact we've never taken a dollar from the, you know, from the dean's office or from the health system. Well, that doesn't work anymore. Trust me. I would have no faculty if I had followed that. But it gave him, he was proud of that and how he ran the department. And it gave him, I think, some leverage that, you know, you give up when, you know, but every anesthesia department in the country that I'm aware of requires subsidy from their health system because of many factors, particularly growth, the supply and demand of anesthesiologists, et cetera. But nevertheless, thinking about that, thinking about how I negotiate with them and the relationships I have with them has been extremely valuable. And I wouldn't have whatever success I've had, you know, without his advice. So I will end with what I think is what's sort of one of the last pictures I knew that I had of Ron in his office. This is in the old building that's been completely remodeled now. Our offices are on the same floor, but that desk and that office is no longer there. And I remember, I think maybe the first day that I, you know, was the chair and sat in there was really a profound moment for me to be sitting in that chair, because I certainly never thought that I would, you know, have the position that he had in such a storied department that I cared so deeply for. I'm thinking this is a Friday because he's a little more, he would always have a tie on. And I know that he would come in, work a half day Friday, and then I think play golf, or that might've been something else, but pretty sure that's what he did. He'd go to the San Francisco Golf Club, of which he was very proud of, and had a locker next to David Bradford, I think, from orthopedic surgery, and some other captain of industry. I think it was Charles Schwab or somebody. And, you know, he really, really enjoyed that place. It meant much to him. Clearly his love of music and golf were really foundational for him. And I admired that. We all knew how hard he worked, incredibly hard to run the department. And I think we're very supportive of him taking a little downtime, because I think it's part of what made him effective. He's got his feet up on the desk with his socks off. So I asked one of our staff yesterday to take a picture of me in my office. And, you know, it's, I don't actually ever use that phone, but, but I figured I would try to look the same. I took my shoes off. And it really, you know, this is to you, Ron, and I'm deeply grateful for everything that you've done for me and for the department. So thanks. All right, so next we have Dr. Judith Hellman, who is the William Young Endowed Professor and Vice Chair for Research. We've talked a bit about the importance of research, and I am so fortunate to have the people that I have helping me run this enormous department. I often get credit for things that I have very little to do with, one of which is the excellence of our research programs. And in fact, this is an example, again, of the visionary work that Ron did, and was able to recruit Judith from Mass General to come, and eventually became our Vice Chair of Research after the untimely passing of Bill Young. And so I think, first of all, appropriate that she's the William Young Endowed Professor and Vice Chair for Research. She's deeply committed to our research programs. And I think, I would say, especially the last few years are so exciting when I'm looking at the type of stuff that we're doing, which is incredibly broad in data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning, pain, et cetera. Our communications team, I hope you take the time to read all the stuff that they send out, because it's really cool stuff. So really delighted to introduce Judith Hellman.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. All right, well, I'm gonna sort of start with a couple of personal experiences that I had over the years in meeting Ron Miller before I came to UCSF and after I came here, and I'll share with you my view of how much he contributed to research in anesthesia in our department, primarily I'm going to talk about it to sort of our research program within the department, because other people are going to be talking a little bit more specifically about his research and his contributions at a national and international level. But I will also speak a little bit to those things. Let's see if I can get the pointer to work. Okay, I first met Ron Miller when I was applying for anesthesia residency. I was a medicine resident at Oregon Health Sciences University, and no, I wasn't really changing the trajectory. I wanted to do both residencies and do intensive care medicine. And so I had a Friday interview with Dr. Miller. I already knew about the Miller anesthesia text. In fact, during my anesthesia clerkship as a third year or fourth year medical student, I got Baby Miller, and it was sort of my Bible for that, or what we called Baby Miller. I'm not sure if that was what it was called at UCSF, but so I was sort of familiar with it. And then I met Ron Miller, and we had a great conversation, and he suggested that I come to Saturday morning grand rounds. Do you remember when it was Saturday morning grand rounds? And it was a pretty impressive experience to come to grand rounds and hear about the complications and everything. At the end of it, he came and found me, and he first brought me to his office. This was a Saturday morning. And he pulled out an article about Columbia University, where I had gone to medical school, talked about ICU, which was what I had mentioned that I wanted to do and ended up doing. And then he brought me and introduced me to Jeanine Wiener-Kronish in the ICU. And it was just incredible for me. I mean, I'd never had somebody who was at that level sort of pay attention and to have listened to what I said during my interview the day before and acted upon it. It was really amazing for me. Sadly, as it turned out, I ended up doing my residency across the country, but 16 or so years later, I came back to UCSF. And I was recruited by, I would say that Michael Gropper and Jeanine Wiener-Kronish sort of helped to initiate my recruitment, and then Ron took over on it. And I might have been the last major research recruit that he had during his time in the department. And then I moved to UCSF. He also listened again. I had kids that were in high school, one of which needed to graduate. I needed some time between when I had the interview, or when I was interviewing for the faculty position and came to UCSF. He listened to that. I had almost 2 years. Also, the lab needed to be renovated and things like that I was coming into. So when I came in, it was a very functional situation. Sometimes it can be very devastating to move when you're on your first major grant. And although I had some hiccups there, he supported me through that. Then in 2009, when he retired, he moved out of his office, the one that Michael showed you in his slides, and into the office suite that my staff were in, my research staff. And it was right around the corner from my lab. So we had many, many conversations between 2009 and 2015 when we moved our labs and we no longer had that space. And I got to hear all about UCSF, all about sort of the world of anesthesia. It was a hugely educational stage of my life, even though I was a mid-career faculty. Okay, so talk a little bit about Ron Miller's research sort of legacies. So first, there's his own research, and other people will talk a little bit about that, but he obviously did very early and critical research on transfusion, massive transfusions and their effects on coagulation. He also did seminal and sustained work on safe use of neuromuscular blockades. He had over 180 publications and has been cited in over 11,000 other publications. So just a prolific career, actually. And for somebody who research was part of their career, but it was also the promotion of anesthesia and anesthesia research, which I think is one of, sort of even larger. He contributed to the anesthesia research on a national level, international level. He served on multiple NIH study sections. He chaired the NIH surgery, anesthesia, and trauma study section. That's a very big feather in one's cap. He was editor-in-chief of Anesthesia and Analgesia, and of course, the Miller's anesthesia textbooks. He was a very strong advocate for research in anesthesiology, and I think his involvement in NIH study sections and being chair of surgery, anesthesia, trauma study section were part of that. He developed paradigm-setting research training programs within the UCSF Department of Anesthesia, which is more what I'll focus the rest of this on. To my eye, and I was a latecomer and sort of a beneficiary of all the great things that he did, he really modernized and expanded the department's research program. He promoted the development of cutting-edge training programs in the department. He supported the development of things like flexible residencies, extended residencies for researcher critical care training, and simulation-based research. And he, I think, really facilitated bench-to-bedside research done by investigators that were already in the department, as well as by bringing in new investigators. I see many of them in the audience, Jeffrey Saul, Helga Eilers, Michael Gropper, Jeanine Wiener-Kronish, I'm not sure she's here, but I know she's going to be speaking later. Many sort of pioneering researchers that were doing amazing bench-to-bedside research. I think he also was very helpful to the specialty in crystallizing the different types of research pathways people can have. One is the sort of research in what I call the research intensive pathway that's exemplified by the pathway to scientific independence in our department, which I'll talk about momentarily, that is really a high level of research commitment that isn't necessarily appropriate for all researchers. And I think as all clinician researchers, and as the specialty is evolving, I think more and more there's kind of a movement towards having balanced research pathways where there's mixes of 50%, 40% research in appropriate areas. And he really facilitated both types of research. Okay, I mentioned that he recruited and retained great people. Another one back there, Phil Bickler, who he retained in the department. I'm just looking around. I don't want to miss anyone, but one of them was William Young. And William Young Bill was an anesthesiologist, a scientist, an educator, a mentor, and an innovator. He was hugely funded by the NIH. It was an amazing recruitment, actually, to get Bill Young to come from Columbia University to here. He did pioneering studies in cerebral blood flow, cerebrovascular disease, AVM biology. He founded the UCSF Center for Cerebrovascular Research, which is still in existence 12 years after he passed away. And he had long-term, really intense NIH funding. He also was really committed to the development of anesthesiologist scientists. So he wasn't just sort of out for his own research career. He was really thoughtful about how he approached research done by the next generations. And along with Ron Miller, Bill Young helped to develop the pathway to scientific independence, which is a sort of more regimented, formalized pathway for junior investigators to get from the stage, maybe entry level during residency, all the way through the point where they might have their first R01 or some sort of an equivalent grant that allows them to be independent. And that program, I just have to insert this also, that what did they have in common? Both of them were accomplished pianists, but Michael has gone into detail about that, so I will just move on from that. Together, Ron Miller, Bill Young, and Manny Pardo developed the Anesthesia Intensive Research Residency, which was formerly known as the Innovative Research Residency Track, and then subsequently as the Research Scholars Track. And this was sort of set up to be an early entry into an intensive research or research intensive career as an anesthesiologist. So it's an extended residency that provides 2 years of 80% protected research time over a 4-year CA1 to 4 period. It's been pretty successful. We started taking residents in, or our first residents started in 2011. First graduates were 2015. So far, we've had 12 graduates. They all, except I think one, have gone into academic medicine. Most of them have stayed in research. Almost all of them have stayed in some capacity. They may have switched directions a little bit. We also now have 7 air scholars. So at a time when it's been hard to actually recruit residents into our research track, we suddenly have sort of a deluge of people that are interested in research, and that's very heartening to see at this time. So I'm going to just close by saying that Ron Miller affected people at every level, from the individual up to the international organizations. Within the department, he helped to grow our research program into something that is, I think, sort of spectacular. We have individuals doing research in these 4 areas that we tried to sort of coalesce. What kind of research are we doing in the department? And we came up with these 4 major themes and sort of sub-themes. Most of them have a bench to bedside component, and I feel like they are part of the legacy of Ron Miller in our department. Thank you.
All right, and we're staying on track. And in fact, as Judith was speaking, we both talked a little bit about the musical talents of Ron Miller and Bill Young. I'm going to embarrass Judith a bit as well, because you can see her singing tomorrow with her family at Hardly Strictly Bluegrass, and I recommend. Sorry, but I enjoy it. All right, next we have Mike Rosenthal, professor of medicine, of anesthesia from Stanford, probably medicine too, I assume, who I met many years ago in my early years in critical care and various other venues. And when we sent out the announcement of this event, he asked if he could say a few words, because he and Ron had overlapped during their military service. And I think we've already seen how foundational that was. So pleasure to see you, and come on up.
Thank you for the round of applause. I'll tell all my friends at Stanford that I was applauded by a group from Cal. That'll get me all sorts of points. I go back a long ways. I guess I met Ron for the first time 2 months before Shelley did. And in 1968, when I came out for my residency, Ron was one of the attendings at the Naval Hospital. And my first weeks was spent quite a bit with Ron as my attending in the operating room. Scary. We did some very interesting and fun things together. We did a rapid sequence induction with cyclopropane, in which the nurse who was holding the small child looked towards the child's head as the child was taking the breaths in, and both of them keeled over at the same time. And the other thing that I remember doing with Ron in the very beginning, just these things come back to your mind when I think about him, was open drop halothane. And that was something I never tried again with any of my residents when I got to Stanford, but that was probably one of the most exciting things. Ron left about 3-4 months after I got there and headed off to Vietnam. And the one thing that was unique about Ron, you folks have already mentioned it, was that the enthusiasm with which he took off to head to Da Nang. Most of the anesthesiologists I saw leave for Vietnam were not happy people. But Ron was extremely enthusiastic, extremely excited about the opportunity, and it showed in what he accomplished when he was there. The work he did was innovative and transformational in terms of transfusion medicine. We all thought that the key was factors 5 and 8, maybe platelets a little bit, and he proved beyond any question of a doubt that the problem was platelets. Now, fortunately, in the military, fresh whole blood was readily available. These guys didn't get a choice as to whether they were going to donate blood or not. They donated when they were told to. So there was a tremendous amount of that, and that's where Ron really pushed. He pushed that when you're doing massive transfusions, you've got to go ahead and consider that, because platelets really were the key. And that has held straight through, although now, of course, we do platelet transfusions. I got to say a word about the bronze medal. It surprised a lot of people that an anesthesiologist working in the secure environment at Da Nang Hospital could get a bronze medal with a combat V. Matter of fact, we were pretty astonished by that. What had happened, for those of you that have never heard the story, is that a gentleman came in, I'm not going to say which military he was part of, wasn't ours, came in with an artillery shell embedded in his body. And Ron volunteered to do the anesthetic for that. And that was where that bronze medal with the combat V came from. But you should know that Ron was not a stupid man. He had a wife, he had kids. He knew that he needed to come back after that 13 months. So Ron got all the extension tubing he could find, hooked it up to the IV, got a large syringe of pentothal and curare, and a whole bunch of sandbags, and was off in the corner of the operating room. But don't take it away from him, guys. If that shell had exploded, there would have been no operating room. So it was still very heroic on his part, and it was very impressive. Ron came back afterwards to San Diego, to the Naval Hospital, and I had the pleasure of learning cardiac anesthesia from Ron. He was the one that taught me that, and he was an amazing teacher, guys. He really was. He was young, he was new, fresh out of his residency, now out of Da Nang, but he was just so enthusiastic, so positive, so supportive. It was something that was just amazing, and you know, I think I learned a lot from that in my own career. I left San Diego. Ron came up here. I left San Diego, went back to Bethesda for several years. And then when I came back to Stanford, there was my mentor, Ron Miller, 25, 30 miles away, but still there for me. Got me into the California Society of Anesthesia and their education division, got me on the refresher course committee. He just kept following my career and being a tremendous mentor. And that leads me to two things that we haven't touched on. We've talked about his mentoring, but one thing that I'm not sure you're all aware of is Ron and I were on the Foundation for Anesthesia Education and Research board together. And at one point, I asked Ron if he would be willing to chair a committee on mentoring in anesthesia, because I felt, and he agreed, that we weren't recognizing how important an aspect that was, and we were not recognizing the contributions people were making. And Ron chaired that committee, worked very hard on it, and that's where the Mentored Research Training Grant came from, was his work, and also the Academy of Mentors from FAIR. He did that work, and he was the one that got it there, and that's really the crux of what FAIR does now today. That Mentored Research Training Grant is so critical, and there may be some awardees here from that. And there was one other thing that Ron got involved in. You probably remember, many of you, in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, there was a tremendous concern about what was the future of anesthesia in this country. Was it going to remain a medical specialty, a physician-led medical specialty? A lot of questions. The American Society of Anesthesiologists got Ron to chair a committee. I worked with him a little on it, but chaired a committee on examining what was the future of anesthesia. And Ron became probably the strongest proponent in our organization, in our society, for what went on outside the operating room as regards anesthesia. And that, of course, to people like Michael and I, is terribly important, because that's critical care, it's pain management, it's preoperative care, it's being involved in hospital administration, and Ron really went to bat for that as being a key factor in terms of the future of anesthesia. And I think we're all indebted to him for that. Michael, thank you for this opportunity. He was my teacher, my mentor, my colleague, my friend, and I miss him. And he had a tremendous influence on my career. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. I thought I'd heard all the war stories, but I had not. So this is good stuff. Next, it's a pleasure to introduce Neal Cohen. Neal also did his residency in the department and has been here longer than I. also counted as one of my friends and mentors in the department since I followed in his footsteps in the intensive care unit. So believe it or not, Neal actually retired. We didn't think it would actually ever happen, but he still remains valuable to me as providing me guidance on many issues in the department. So I hope he will continue to do so. But pleasure to introduce Neal Cohen.
Thanks, Michael. I do have some prepared remarks, but based on what's happened up to this point, a couple other comments. One is I had the privilege of interviewing Ron for the Wood Library, and many of the comments I'm making are based on that interview. I learned a whole lot about who Ron was and how he thought about things and how he planned his career. And the other thing I wanted to mention that I hadn't thought about is that some of you may remember that Ron used to play the piano at the Bohemian Club every Thursday. It was really important to him. One time he came back, this is many years ago, before cell phones. He came back to his office and realized he left his music in the taxi. This is music he had from high school. He was devastated. And he spent the rest of the afternoon trying to figure out where it could be. He had no idea what taxi company he was in. He knew the color of the taxi, and he looked in the yellow pages where there were some pictures of taxis, and he called every taxi company, and eventually they found the music. That was Ron. I mean, when he was on a mission, he was on a mission. So let me just go over some of the, Michael asked me to talk about Ron and his international stature and career. And I just want to go over some of what I understand about how he developed into the kind of person he was as an anesthesiologist, as a friend to many of us, and clearly as a mentor to many in anesthesia across the world. Ron's contributions to the department, UCSF, and the specialty are well recognized, and many people have talked about those. They're acknowledged both nationally and internationally. Those working closely with him witnessed firsthand the commitment to the department and his broad influence on the specialty. Yet many of us may not have understood the global admiration he inspired. For many, Ron was quite literally a rock star. As most of you know, Ron was born and raised in Indiana. He came from a humble background, as was mentioned. His father worked for Studebaker, as was mentioned, and Ron attended the University of Indiana on a Studebaker scholarship. I think that $500 a year that Shelley mentioned for 4 years of college before going to medical school. As Shelley mentioned, Ron was not the best student in high school. According to Ron, his mother used to take him to Notre Dame and walk around the campus hoping that he would pick up some skills and capabilities and eventually become something with his life, and obviously he did. So Studebaker is what made the man. Ron's move his first move beyond Indiana was to the West Coast for an internship in general medicine with the intention to pursue a general medical practice, probably in Southern California or back in Indiana. But despite his best laid plans, and I think as many of you know, Ron always had best laid plans, a brief anesthesia rotation at Riverside Community Hospital made his professional plan take a dramatic turn. Captivated by what he experienced in the OR on a short rotation and a textbook known as the Green Book, he decided to transition to anesthesia. He applied to UCSF as the only department because the Green Book was published by a faculty member in the department. I think it was Dr. Cullen, but I wasn't around for the Green Book. After completing his residency, Ron made another important decision that would shape his career in his specialty. At the time, many of you know, the US had a draft and a lottery to determine who would serve in the military and who would not. The draft applied to all college graduates except those who went to medical school. So those who went to college were in a lottery, and some would get drafted and some would not. If you went to medical school, you were going to serve in the military. The exception was a Berry deferment. The Berry deferment allowed Ron to control his destiny. He applied for the deferment. The deferment meant that he would serve in the military as an anesthesiologist rather than a general medical officer. Ron was keenly aware of the plan, not his own, to enter the military, and he knew he'd go to Vietnam. As Mike mentioned, he did his homework and actually went to try and figure out how he could control his time in anesthesia. Before going into the military, after completing his residency, he felt uncomfortable and he didn't feel as capable as his colleagues like George Gregory in physiology and pharmacology. So he elected to do another year. And the goal was to improve his clinical skills. Here's the picture that you've seen before of Dr. Cullen and Ron. Ron wanted to spend more time learning anesthesia. However, Dr. Cullen encouraged, or perhaps mandated, that he do some research. So Ron met with Ted Eager, who suggested that Ron study muscle relaxant pharmacology. This experience represented his first foray into clinical and translational research, laying the foundation for his academic career. It also established his career-long habit of asking why every time he confronted a clinical, research, or administrative tradition that he thought might not be appropriate. And he did it many times with hospital administration. This mindset shaped how Ron approached all of his roles throughout his career, sometimes to the dismay of his colleagues. As an aside, and Judith talked about this, though Ron would go on to publish influential studies on muscle relaxants and transfusion medicine, he often referred to his research as pedestrian. He mentioned it to me many times. Not because it lacked impact, but because it addressed practical and clinically meaningful questions. He believed in addressing research questions that mattered at the bedside and in the operating room, and that philosophy defined his career. As was true for Ron's entire career, before completing his residency and fellowship, he carefully planned the next chapter. Knowing he would be deployed to Vietnam, he did his homework and found out that at Da Nang, other physicians were actually involved in doing research. So he wanted to ensure that he went to Da Nang, since he was going to Vietnam anyway. What he hoped was that he could continue to do his muscle relaxant pharmacology. To increase his chances, as Mike Rosenthal suggested, he actually met with I think it's the head of naval research, to pitch his desire to go to Da Nang and convince them to support his plan. You've all seen this picture. When he arrived in Da Nang, and after witnessing the devastating injuries sustained by the troops and their desperate need for massive blood transfusions despite limited supply, he redirected his research focus to transfusion medicine. Recognizing that few anesthesiologists worked in the area at the time, he saw an opportunity to contribute meaningfully in a way that might advance his career. His wartime research in transfusion medicine, along with his work in muscle relaxant pharmacology, opened the door for his extraordinary academic career. He returned to UCSF, continued publishing studies based on his experiences in Vietnam, as well as returning to study muscle relaxant pharmacology, often with the transplant nephrologist. Based on his scientific contributions, he was able to serve on NIH study sections, as has been mentioned, and have advisory roles for the FDA, among many other honors he never imagined would happen. Ron was also able to develop close relationships with anesthesiologists from across the US and internationally. He spent his sabbaticals in Holland and worked closely with other anesthesiologists from Europe, Asia, Australia, and other countries, collaborating on research activities, fostering collaborative professional society relationships, and encouraging international visitors to the department, a trend that has been actively continued by Dr. Gropper. Our department has benefited greatly from the knowledge, experience, and diverse perspective of our international colleagues. Based on his experiences and relationships, Ron came to understand the importance of the global commitment to advancing anesthesia practice and its scientific underpinnings. As editor-in-chief for Anesthesia and Analgesia, he and those that followed him changed the focus of the journal to become the true international source for scientific and clinical advances in the specialty. He did the same for Miller's Anesthesia, engaging a diverse group of authors to ensure that it would become the most comprehensive textbook in the growing specialty of anesthesiology. Moving from a focus on operative anesthesia in the US to encompass the full spectrum of perioperative medicine, pain medicine, critical care medicine, sleep medicine, and palliative care internationally. Each edition has included authors from around the world, some here, to provide a broad perspective and thoughtful approach to understanding the scientific underpinnings of the specialty, diverse approaches to clinical practice and education. Ron definitely reaped many personal rewards based on his longstanding relationships with colleagues from around the world. Having the international opportunities broadened Ron's perspective and clearly impacted his career and ability to advance the specialty. Numerous honors were bestowed on Ron, all well-deserved and for which he always felt humble to receive. The list of international visiting professorships here and honorary memberships are impressive by any standards. While all these honors were greatly appreciated by Ron, the last one on this slide is the one that probably meant more to him today. That is a Distinguished Service Award, Distinguished Alumni Award from Indiana University. Based on his international travels, Ron, a young man from South Bend, Indiana, achieved global services status with United Airlines. He was proud of that. He appreciated his international traveling experiences, but not without some challenges. Just as Ron carefully orchestrated his career, he wanted to have the same control over travel, both within the US and beyond. Right, Shelley? Not an easy feat, nor one he took casually. Traveling with Ron meant early arrival at the airport, no last-minute distractions, nor missed connections. Ron planned each adventure carefully and wanted to control each step so that he would not be caught off guard or without a clear plan to move forward. The careful planning didn't always work out the way he hoped. He frequently expressed some frustration and intimidation when having to confront travel hassles, whether cancellations, delays, visa issues, medical emergencies, or others. Global services helped him deal with some of the challenges, but was not a panacea for the hassles and interesting experiences he had when traveling. Just a couple examples. According to Ron, I can't validate this. On a flight across the Atlantic, a patient died mid-flight and was put in the seat next to him and covered with a blanket for the rest of the journey. Whether true or not, the image of Ron sitting next to a corpse covered with a blanket makes me laugh. Even US travel could be a challenge for Ron, since his approach to travel and its challenges was not often shared by others. One US adventure, he selectively and confidentially, though we know when Ron did something confidential, it's a relative confidentiality because everybody knew about it. He shared an experience at the Denver airport. During a lengthy delay, he and Gail wandered through the shops in the terminal, a long way from the departure gate. Gail decided to go into a dress shop and try on some clothes, while Ron waited anxiously to avoid the missing flight. As time marched on, Ron became more and more agitated, finally asking Gail to leave, only to find that she was locked in the dressing room. Ron's response? Break down the door, pull Gail out, and run on their way to the gate. They made it with time to spare. I've never known how the poor merchant in the store dealt with that or whether they ever fixed the door. During some of his international travels, Ron would be both excited and honored to have special experiences he would never have imagined would be available to him. While traveling in China, he walked along the Great Wall, reflecting on his journey from South Bend, Indiana. Just as he was experiencing the significance, he ran into the chair of the Department of Pediatrics from UCSF. Reminded him of just how small the world can be. His bubble burst, but he pushed on and enjoyed the experience nonetheless. Ron's leadership as department chair was transformational. He prioritized clinical experience, expanded the department's research portfolio, and brought global insights into UCSF. He recognized the opportunity for anesthesiologists to evolve into perioperative physicians. As Mike has mentioned, a vision he championed as chair of the ASA task force on the future of anesthesia. Needless to say, Ron pursued his long and successful academic career, what he referred to in a way he referred to as vigor. He never wavered from his commitment to his career, to the department, and to the specialty. He achieved more than most of us could ever imagine. And he did it with dignity, diligence, sometimes humor. At the same time, Ron was a pragmatist, having an intense dislike for bureaucracy and policies. He was on a mission and accomplished it in his own way. He had high standards and strong opinions. Throughout his career, he grew as a leader in anesthesiology, as a chair, and as a friend to many of us. Although Mike suggests that Ron was committed to mentoring, Ron really never understood the concept of mentoring. He was self-driven to achieve his goals, but in many ways, in his own way, he served as mentor to many of us and allowed our careers to thrive because of his leadership, his guidance, and his example. The Department of Specialty are better because Ron was a member. Yes. There was a montage. Oh, no, never mind. All right. It's okay. It's okay.
Oh, all right.
Is that the pointer?
Thank you, Neal. Next, we're going to invite up Merlin Larson. Merlin actually trained at Stanford and spent 20 years in private practice in San Francisco before joining the department. And I remember that. I said, I don't know that had ever happened before. He brought an incredible skill set of experience and also a very gifted educator, particularly when it came to regional anesthesia and others, but also has a deep interest in anesthesia history. And so I thought no one better to describe Ron's impact on the history of our specialty than Merlin Larson.
It's my honor to be asked to present at this symposium in honor of Dr. Miller. His curriculum vitae is incredible, and I'm not going to expand on it. So many classical papers, books, and of course he led the department for 25 years. I want to concentrate on my interaction with him at the Moffitt Lung Hospital. I don't know if anybody recognizes this building, but it's at 5th and Geary. It used to be a hospital where I worked for 20 years. They went bankrupt in 1988. I was 50 years old and unemployed. And I had a high maintenance wife, 2 kids, and a mortgage, and all the usual trappings of a 50-year-old anesthesiologist. I asked Ron if maybe I could work at UCSF. And he gave me an ambiguous answer. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't think you're qualified. But he gave me 1 year. He said, okay, you stay here for a year, we'll see what happens. But look for another job. So I became an attending. Now we've seen this before. I wanted to become the person who taught the procedures instead of doing procedures. It's not easy adjustment, but there were a number of great clinicians in the department at the time, and I learned from them indirectly. It's not like they came to me and said, look, try to do it this way. I learned it through the residents. I'll give you one example. I was going to do fiber optic intubation. I would say to the resident, now put this wand in the mouth, look for the glottis, put it through the glottis, put the tube through. The resident would pause, and then he would say, with all due respect, Dr. Larson, I did one of these with Dr. Katz a few days ago, and he told me to do it in 3 simple steps. Pause, pause. I said, well, that sounds interesting. Why don't you do it that way? Zip, zip, zip. Tube goes in, slick as silk. And so I said to the resident, well, I've learned something. Now I could spend the next hour talking about things I learned from these clinicians. And I see Jenna Fisher there. I could learn from him. So during the year, I picked up tips from the clinicians in our department. Ron Miller gave me encouragement. Hang in there. You're still working here. Okay. I did question him I wondered why he didn't come around and call me aside and ask me why I had these peculiar idiosyncrasies. I carried a belt, and where the hammer would normally be, I had my pupillometer. In the fanny pack, I had a portable nerve simulator. And also inside, I had a Merlin 3 blade and a laryngoscope battery that actually worked, that had decent batteries. He never did say anything to me. And the year came to an end, and nothing was said about me moving on. We did develop some camaraderie because we rotated weeks doing E1, and we talked about various attendings who didn't like their assignments, and it was quite amusing. I've cut out George Gregory. Is George here? I cut you out of the picture, sorry. We also conducted ground rounds. They used to be on Saturday. The attending is used to present their own complications. And I presented a number of complications, some of which involved death in the operating room. But he was also very supporting of, go backwards. No, couldn't go back. We got to go back. Anybody help me go backwards? It's not going back. Oh, there we go. Okay, now I want to go back almost 60 years to how we did anesthesia in the late 60s, because this is going to illustrate what Dr. Miller did to the department over those years. First of all, we bubbled oxygen through a copper kettle up here on the left. And then we also administered a flow of other gases and entered them into the circuit like we have today. The pop-up valve was, the gases were released directly into the operating room. So during the week, the gases increased in our blood levels and then dissipated by Monday. They were almost absent. We didn't have monitors. We used esophageal and precordial stethoscopes, and they were connected to a molded earpiece. We took blood pressures with a Tycho's gauge, and we watched the needle fluctuate back and forth to measure diastolic and systolic pressures. We learned to hold the mask on the face for long periods of time, and we used both hands because one hand would eventually cramp. Paper records. But my main point here is that anesthesiologists at the time were mainly confined to the operating room. We didn't venture out much except into OB. We did OB anesthetics with caudals, which is okay, except about 10% of the time the sacral hiatus was closed, and so we couldn't do a caudal. Then we set the patient up and did an normal epidural. The mothers were placed on their stomach, and we used high concentrations of local anesthetics, 1.5% lidocaine, so they couldn't feel anything. And the deliveries were eventually done with forceps. So now I want to point out the changes that occurred. Some of this happened during Dr. Hamilton's tenure as chief, but accelerated when Dr. Miller was chairman for his 25 years. We added monitors, new drugs, new techniques, computerized anesthesia records, automatic dispensing cabinets, Pyxis. Primarily, what we did is during those years, expand the specialty into diverse areas of the hospital. And we became the physicians that we were trained to be. And Dr. Rosenthal has already alluded to this. But I think Mike may notice this also. Changes produce stress in the department. And there were objections to some of these changes. When I was over at French, I told the anesthesia folks there that we're going to stop using curare because there's a better drug called pampuronium. And they told me, they said, no, you can't tell me how to practice medicine. I'm going to write to the chief of the staff and tell him what you're trying to do to me. So, I mean, it does create stress. And I, for one, opposed the idea of a computerized anesthesia record. And the news got back to Dr. Miller, I'm sure, but he was very firm and stayed with these changes and advanced the department into the 21st century. Now, I close with this slide about fame. There's various ways to achieve fame. Dr. Miller achieved fame through achievement. He wrote the papers, he wrote the book. I achieved fame. And I say this with tongue in cheek. And let me explain. My wife and I like to travel to major cities around the world and visit museums. We'll stay there for a week. I step away every now and then to visit the major teaching hospital to see if I could talk to somebody there about how anesthetics are delivered. When they hear I'm from San Francisco, they say, do you know Ronald Miller? And then I say, yes, well, he's the chairman of our department. Well, within 30 seconds, I become famous through association on the bottom. And then they say, can you come back tomorrow and give a lecture to our residents? So fame through association. So in conclusion, Dr. Miller resuscitated my career. He did not object to my peculiarities, my idiosyncrasies, and he promoted a measure of fame through association for me. Most importantly, he moved our department into the 21st century, a process that's continuing today. And I reiterate what other people have said already, that this department is known all over the world because of the textbook. The people I met, they said this is our go-to information. Anyway, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Merlin. In spite of being chair of the department for 10 years, they still ask, did I know Ron Miller? So I don't expect that to change. So also I'm there by association. All right, next, it's a pleasure to introduce Jeanine Wiener-Kronish. Jeanine will be here by Zoom from, I believe now, Philadelphia. So Jeanine is a great friend and a mentor. In fact, I came to work in a research lab to get my PhD before I went to medical school. And that's where I met Jeanine and Michael Mathey, two of my most important mentors. And we've known each other a long time. She is a highly successful intensivist and researcher and continues to be so. And then sadly left UCSF to go to Boston. I hear they have some hospitals there. And she had a great career there as chair of the Department of Anesthesia at Mass General. And so it's a pleasure to introduce my friend, Jeanine.
Well, Michael, it's my honor to speak, and hopefully you can all hear me. It's okay?
Hold on, we're just, oh, there we are. Okay, good.
Okay. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So today, given what you've heard, I thought I'd emphasize what Dr. Miller always talked to me about, which was the pursuit of excellence, trying to make an impact on medicine, all of medicine. So I want to start, if I can have the first two slides, please, just quickly. Yeah, he was my sponsor, and I'll talk about that. Next slide. So we'll start with the next slide after that, and that's 1958. So the 1950s, I think it's important to paint a picture for you what the 1950s were like. They may have some relevance to what we're going through today. I'll let you decide. So in 1953, there was a meeting in Copenhagen of all the experts known at that time in polio. And sadly, they probably excreted polio into the water, so that then there was this huge epidemic of polio in Copenhagen. So much so that every day, 50 patients would come to the hospital for infectious disease, and 90% of those patients would die from polio. And at the time, nobody knew what polio was doing. They actually thought it was causing renal failure. They thought it was causing encephalitis. And they were so desperate at this hospital, they called for an anesthesiologist. There were only 2 to 3 anesthesiologists in all of Denmark. and they asked for Bjorn Ibsen. Bjorn Ibsen actually had spent time in Boston and had seen tetanus in the United States. So when he saw these children and adults, he said, they have respiratory failure. I can save them by doing a tracheotomy and ventilating them. They said, prove it. They gave him a child who was dying, and he did prove it. He spent the night and the day hand ventilating her, and she survived. So then they did tracheotomies on all the patients in the hospital, and the mortality went from 90% to about 30%. I tell you this story because it directly is influenced by this gentleman. So that episode, like many of the epidemics we've gone through since, changed medicine. Bjorn Ibsen started ICUs as we know them today. Based on his work, mechanical ventilators were created. Respiratory physiology was worked on by Dr. Comro and others. And Dr. Severinghaus invented a CO2 electrode that objectively allowed us to assess carbon dioxide in arterial blood so that you didn't have to have experience to recognize respiratory failure. You could prove it by measuring arterial blood. I would say that had an impact on medicine. That was the kind of pursuit of excellence that Dr. Miller was talking about. And so in 1958, Dr. Comro recruited Dr. Severinghaus and Dr. Cullen to come to UCSF and create an independent department of anesthesia. And just to give you, again, a reference, I worked for Harvard for 12 years, for actually more. And they didn't create the Department of Anesthesia until 1969. So the West Coast was way ahead. Dr. Comro, Dr. Cullen, Dr. Severinghaus were way ahead of the East Coast. Next slide, please. And there's Dr. Comro with Dr. Hamilton. So there was this incredible relationship between the CVRI and the Department of Anesthesia. All right, and if we can have the next slide, please. 1968, remember the Vietnam War is going on. It started in 1965 and went through 1973. And I bring it up because there were other impacts on medicine that we were feeling in anesthesia. One is, as Michael had talked about, Da Nang lung, which is ARDS, and it was first described in 1967. So when I was in medical school, I worked with Dr. Fairley, who was an anesthesiologist and an expert on how to treat ARDS, did some of the earliest studies. So was Peter Suter there in the department from Switzerland. So we had leaders in ARDS and critical care in the Department of Anesthesia quite early on. And there's Dr. Miller. And he becomes chair after Dr. Hamilton because Dr. Cullen becomes dean of the medical school. And then Dr. Hamilton follows suit. I would say it's another indication of how robust and how respected this department was, because the chairs of this department became leaders in the medical school. And if I can have the next slide, please. This was Dr. Severinghaus, who personally was very special to me and taught me. And I met him even before I became an anesthesiologist. And next slide, please. This is Dr. Eager, who also taught me anesthesia, an amazing pharmacologist. Next slide, please. And then in 1983, we have Dr. Miller's department. Basically, it's going to be his department. And you have Saul Schneider, who's an expert in OB anesthesia, Morley Singer. Again, a department, I would say, that was amazing in terms of research and clinical prowess, and was meeting the needs and pursuing excellence in all of medicine. Next slide, please. So in 1984, I became a resident in anesthesia, and I just briefly want to explain why that's relevant. Next slide, please. So just to digress, Dr. Clements and Dr. Gregory were pursuing excellence at this time with the creation of surfactant and the treatment of premature neonates and changing their mortality. So again, anesthesiologists changing medicine, changing all of medicine. And I would just say my first patient on ECMO was a patient that Sam Hoggood and I took care of in the neonatology ICU, because that's where ECMO was done, where they first initiated ECMO at UCSF. Ultimately, we did have ECMO come down to the adult ICU, but it was in the neonatal ICU first. Next slide. And I just show 1985 because I was learning from all of these faculty. I was learning critical care. I was learning OB anesthesia. I was going to the VA with these individuals. And I want you to notice the change in the makeup of the department. It's getting larger. It's got women in it. And so then 1986 is when I finished my residency. Next slide. And I would show you that Dr. Miller was involved, of course, with Cedric Payton, who was at the VA, but his wife was a leader of the medical school, Dorothy Payton. And next slide. And there's Dr. Fairley, who I met and worked with at the San Francisco General Hospital, it was called when I was a resident and faculty, early faculty. Next slide. So 1986, I graduate. And next slide, please. I mean, the truth was, I became an anesthesiologist because of Dr. Miller. I had been a pulmonologist. Next slide, please. And there I am. I don't know if you can see me on the lower part. I started medical school in 1972. And when I graduated in 1976, I went into internal medicine just because the people who were influential in medical school had been internists. And we actually didn't have a rotation at that time in anesthesia at all. Next slide. And I spent 4 years after my clinical rotation as a pulmonary fellow in Dr. Staub's lab. And here's Dr. Gropper. He was one of my lab mates. And we did pretty well in the lab. We had a lot of publications. We got some grants. So I approached Dr. Nadell, who was the division chief of pulmonary, and said, I really like this. I want to stay in academic medicine. And he looked at me and he said, well, I could give you a job, but I couldn't give you a salary. So then I went to the chief of medicine, who said, oh, women really shouldn't be in academic medicine. So I was kind of upset. I really wanted to be in academic medicine. So I got the suggestion from my lab mates that I should really consider anesthesia because, first of all, they ran the ICU and I wanted to be an intensivist. And they had a new chair, Dr. Miller. So I went to Dr. Miller, and the next slide, please. And he said, if you train in anesthesia, I'll make sure you succeed in academic medicine. And he was absolutely true to his word. That was the luckiest day of my life, I'd like to say, that I became an anesthesiologist and I got to work with Dr. Miller. Next slide. Because he gave me a lab right after my residency. I worked with Dr. Sawa. We worked on the virulent systems of Pseudomonas, that's Pseudomonas. And in fact, Dr. Sawa is now creating an mRNA vaccine that very well may block some of the major virulent systems of Pseudomonas, particularly important in cystic fibrosis and bronchiectasis, and perhaps acute lung injury. Next slide. And I got to be an intensivist. And unlike Michael, I spent my clinical career in the ICU. got to work with Linda Liu and David Shimabukuro, and I loved it every day. I loved being in intensive care. Next slide. And Dr. Miller nominated me for the surgical anesthesia trauma study section. I spent 4 years there. Next slide. He sponsored me to become an editor of anesthesiology. I did that for 12 years. Next slide. And I left in 2008 to be chair at MGH. And this is the department I left. It was amazing. You can see in the back, Dr. Gropper, Dr. Hellman, amazing individuals, amazing researchers. It was something I really wanted to emulate and create on the East Coast. Next slide. And so I got to be a chair, and I owe that to Dr. Miller. Next slide, please. This is the department since Dr. Gropper has taken over. It's a superb department. I think it's even better, larger, fills every part of medicine and is pursuing excellence in medicine. And I think we owe that to Dr. Miller. And I'm very grateful to be here today and express my gratitude for having worked at UCSF and been part of the faculty. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jeanine. That's wonderful. It's scary to see what I used to look like, but thank you. All right, we're going to take a break now. You'll get to socialize a little bit. We're a little bit behind schedule. Let's come back around 2:45. And there's going to be plenty of time at the end where you'll be able to chat and get together with everybody, but we'll try to stay on schedule. So thank you.
Hey, Lars. Good to see you.
All right, let's please take a seat, and we're going to keep going. Everyone. And while you're sitting down, I want to remind you that our department is having its alumni reception at the ASA on Sunday at 6 p.m. at the Casa Katrina, which I believe is near all the, you should have gotten an email to the alumni list, but please join us there in San Antonio. Next, it's a pleasure to introduce Lars Eriksson. I've known Lars for many years. In fact, he spent 2 separate years on sabbatical within the department. So I don't know when the first one was, but it was, I think I was maybe still a resident, possibly. So I've known Lars for a long time. I've had the opportunity to visit him in Stockholm. He's the chair of the Department of Anesthesia at the Karolinska Hospital in Stockholm. Has a distinguished career as a researcher and as an educator. And I'm very thankful to have him as one of the co-editors of the Miller textbook. And so I thought no one better to give the international perspective of the impact that Ron has had than Lars Eriksson. So come on up.
Dear Dr. Gropper and dear colleagues and friends, this is a day that when we remember and reflect over Ronald Miller's giant lifetime achievements in medicine and in anesthesiology. From the perspective of the department here at UCSF and also within the United States, but also his extraordinary contributions in other countries and to global anesthesiology. My name is Lars Eriksson from the Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm, and I'm deeply honored to have been invited and included in this very important symposium today. Ron Miller was truly the most influential anesthesiologist in the world of his time. The Department of Anesthesia and Perioperative Care here at UCSF has for decades played a key role behind the academic and clinical developments of modern anesthesia practice and in establishing our specialty within medicine. Ron Miller's contributions must be seen in this light, and the fact that he consistently expanded the department for decades by holding and recruiting some of the very best talents and experts in the world. He gathered an extraordinary group of leaders and clinician scientists in all fields of relevance for our practice at the same time and under the same roof. In parallel to this, Ron also consistently, over several decades, invited young and mid-career anesthesiologists from Europe and beyond to visit, work, exchange ideas, and learn from the UCSF faculty. From an outside perspective, the department at UCSF in this way served as a role model for the integration of frontline academic and clinical anesthesia for generations of anesthesiologists, not only from Europe and Scandinavia, but from all around the globe. Miller's textbook of anesthesia, introduced in 1981, was of course instrumental in this context and became rapidly a standard reference literature for the anesthesia community. This masterpiece, with its foundation here at UCSF, has for many years been easily available in all anesthesia libraries, conference and coffee rooms around the globe. In the 7th edition of the book that came out in 2007, Ron had taken the initiative to involve more authors from other continents, including Europe, Asia, Australia, Africa, and South America. As a consequence of this, the book gradually became truly international and expanded its area of impact into most parts of the world. Of course, all of these initiatives and achievements reinforced the position of UCSF as one of the most important powerhouses in anesthesia worldwide. My own sabbaticals here in 1990, Michael, and 2010 are true examples of this and provided an enormous amount of inspiration and examples of how to build competitive and strong academic and clinical anesthesiology departments. There are in fact many things at my own department at Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm that are heavily influenced by the wonderful time I spent here with you. Ron told me during one of his trips to Stockholm that for him, the importance of international exchange and moving one's own practice to a completely new and different environment came as an eye-opener for him during his sabbatical in the Netherlands in the late 1970s. Ron spent 1 year at Nijmegen University Hospital in the Netherlands to study neuromuscular pharmacology with some of the most influential leaders in Europe at that time. Here you can see him together with Professor Stanley Feldman from London and his wife. Ron came to know European leaders such as Jan Krug, Leo Boy, Shandor Agoston, and he also encountered Rajinder Miracle, Jennifer Hunter, Jürgen Vivi Mogensen, Bill Baumann, John Stanlake, Edmer Tassoni, Sylvia Schwartz, Walter Buselli, and many, many more. His broad exposure to European anesthesia and perioperative care started during this stay in the Netherlands and continued for all the years up to a decade ago. Over all these years, he became an honorary member of a majority of national societies within Europe, including an honorary fellowship to the Royal College of Anaesthetists in London, in addition to all his many national honorary awards from Asia, Australia, and South America. But Ron's interest in neuromuscular pharmacology had started much earlier. During the second year of his pharmacology fellowship at UCSF between 1967 and 1968, he published his very first academic paper that you can see here, entitled The Potentiation of Neuromuscular Blocking Agents by Quinidine. Shortly thereafter, he published another 3 studies on neuromuscular pharmacology. One of them you can see here, left, and one study together with Dr. Eager on the interaction between neuromuscular blocking drugs and inhaled anesthetics. After Dr. Miller's return from the military service back to UCSF in 1971, he started the most active academic program within neuromuscular pharmacology. Just to give you an example here, during the following 6 years, from his start until his full professorship in anesthesia, Ron produced 49 publications in leading journals of anesthesiology. After returning to San Francisco from his sabbatical in Nijmegen, Ron and his group developed a novel HPLC technique to determine the pharmacokinetics of an array of clinically used neuromuscular blocking agents and their metabolites. Funded by the NIH and other prestigious sources, his group published a long series of now classical publications, improving our understanding of the kinetics of a large number of compounds and their metabolites in various patient groups and under various anesthetic conditions. Here his expertise in pharmacology and clinical science helped him and his group to produce landmark studies that for many years have served as the base for our understanding and knowledge in anesthesia and critical care pharmacology. Needless to say, over several decades, Ron played a key role behind the clinical development of all steroid-based neuromuscular blocking compounds and novel cyclodextrin reversal agents. It was also during these years that Ron Miller developed long-term collaborations with neuromuscular researchers in Europe and beyond. Starting with sporadic meetings here in the United States and in UK in the 1970s, this network soon formed the now classical series of international neuromuscular conferences regularly held around the globe. Here's a photo taken in the mid-1980s during one of these early meetings in Europe with Ron, as you can see here, standing in the front. And here is a photo from a meeting in Denmark, a little bit more relaxed condition, I would say, together with Jørgen Viby Mogensen, professor and chair at the Copenhagen University Hospital. But it's not only as an expert within the neuromuscular field that Ron Miller moved academic medicine forward. For more than 35 years, he both served, led, and developed the department at UCSF as a leading institution in the world of anesthesiology and critical care medicine. With his undisputable dedication to anesthesiology in general and neuromuscular research in particular, our specialty would never have reached its key position in modern medicine without the pioneer work done by Dr. Ronald Miller. You will be missed by all of us around the globe that had the privilege to have known you. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Lars. Next, one of the great legacies that Ron left, of course, is our educational programs. Year after year after year, we're rated as one of the top residencies in the world. Many of us trained there. Coming up is Manny Pardo, who is our vice chair for education. He trained in the department, and I remember he was a year or two behind me. Frankly, he frightened me because he was so advanced compared to where I was at his time. But anyway, he's a great partner to me and leading our education efforts, and it's a pleasure to introduce Manny. Thanks.
So this slide shows my timeline and where I overlap professionally at UCSF with Dr. Miller. So as some of you have highlighted, Dr. Miller started at UCSF as a resident in 1965, joined the faculty in 1970, became the chair in 1984, stepped down as chair 25 years later in 2009, and then became an emeritus professor in 2011. So when I started at UCSF as a resident in 1992, he'd already been chair for 8 years. And then for 8 years after he was no longer the chair, I still worked with him, collaborating on the Basics of Anesthesia 6, and then finally the 7th edition, which published in 2017. So that's where I fit in Dr. Miller's timeline. So this is my first exposure to Dr. Miller. This is the residency training brochure when I was a resident applicant in 1990. And interestingly, the description of the program used the word diversity twice, which we are actually not allowed to state anymore in our GME descriptions of the program. Interestingly, that brochure had a listing of all the faculty in the department in 1990, and that was a grand total of 59 faculty at all sites. I looked through that list and I did work with almost every single faculty listed at that time. So when I started in 1992, the resident welcome picnic on the upper left was at Dr. Miller's house in Mill Valley. So we trekked across the bridge, foggy San Francisco, up to sunny Marin County. That was the final year of having it at his house. And I'm not sure, there were rumors about why it's no longer at his house. I don't know if they were true, but after that, it moved to somebody else's house. So what did residents think of Dr. Miller? So when he stepped down as chair in 2009, I sort of gathered some thoughts from residents. We actually had a dinner in his honor at the time at the San Francisco Golf Club. And so these are some things that residents, who were residents when he was chair, what they thought of him. So one said, he has an avuncular kindness that I really appreciate. Another said, whenever I talk to him, he always gives thoughtful, deep answers. The other one said, he never gives a short answer to a question. And somebody else said, he's like a Boy Scout from the Midwest, thoughtful and kind. So as a resident, I got to do an anesthetic with Dr. Miller. Well, not quite as exciting as Dr. Rosenthal's description of working with Dr. Miller in 1968, but this is an anesthesia record I had in my archives from 1994. So I was a CA2 resident. It's an exploratory laparotomy for bleeding in a patient who had a kidney pancreas transplant. And judging by the time, Dr. Miller must have been on call. It's at 8:00 p.m. He did take call in the 1990s, and I must have been the resident on call. The surgeon was Dr. Peter Stock, who I work with to this day. He must have been a quite junior assistant professor of surgery at the time, transplant surgeon. And so the patient, looking at the record in some more detail, the starting hematocrit was 21. So the patient was, probably a little bit sick. I mean, it was a true emergent case. And so there I was, the resident on call working with Dr. Miller. So he came across as being very kind, as I quoted from other residents, but it was nevertheless quite intimidating to work with him. So here are some of the medications that we gave. Now, why was it intimidating to work with him? Well, of course, the textbook that we all called Baby Miller, which, by the way, he never referred to it as Baby Miller. He would usually call it either the basics, or he would just say the small book. And that's how Dr. Miller referred to it. Now, interestingly, I subsequently met, when I became the program director in 2009, I met the program director from the University of Indiana, where Dr. Stolting was the chair at the time that this book came out. And what he told me was that in Indiana, they called this book Baby Stolting. So that was interesting. I said, well, we don't call it that. Now, the other reason it was intimidating to work with Dr. Miller, a few of the previous speakers have mentioned this. We knew that he was an expert in muscle relaxants. I mean, this is a review on anesthesiology about the clinical pharmacology of vecuronium, which is the muscle relaxant that I use to take care of this particular patient. We, of course, knew that, as Dr. Gropper mentioned in many conversations, Dr. Miller would bring up Vietnam. I had many meetings with him of which the substance of the meeting was done in about 20 minutes. And then there were 40 minutes of various reflections on meandering topics that would often include Vietnam. And so we knew that he was an expert on massive transfusion. This JAMA article from 1971, in fact, if you look, I looked up the methods section. This was done in Da Nang. That was the methods. This is where that study came from. So we knew all that. And he had a quiet presence that was intimidating in a different way. For example, when you work with Dr. Eager as a resident, he would ask you a million questions in a Socratic method, as many of you have probably experienced yourself. And that was a different kind of intimidation. Dr. Miller would just quietly tell you what to do and what meds to give and when. And so if you look here how we anesthetized this patient, we gave thiopental, and so anybody here hasn't used that in a long time. So 3 to 5 milligrams per kilogram is a typical induction dose. This patient was about 80 kilograms. So that's a 1 per kilo dose. So much smaller than a typical induction dose. And if you'll notice, there's no muscle relaxant given for intubation. The first vecuronium is just shortly before surgical incision. So I must have intubated with just inhaled anesthetic and a tiny bit of thiopental on board and no muscle relaxant. The other thing you'll notice, so the patient needed 3 units of blood, which we just gave right away in the paper documentation days. And we did reverse with neostigmine and glycopyrrolate. I am sure, in the record below, which I cut out, I know I was monitoring train of 4. And when Dr. Larson showed that photo of him with his portable nerve stimulator, I remember how Dr. Miller, when he lectured to the residents about muscle relaxants, he would always say, test the nerve stimulator out on yourself to make sure the battery is working and that it's actually working. Now, so that's how we would, now of course we would test it at a low amperage and not the maximum milliamperage, but that's one of the things he told, always test it out on yourself to make sure your nerve stimulator is working. So I'm sure that I did that, and we documented and we reversed with neostigmine and glycopyrrolate. Now, the other interesting part about looking back at this anesthetic record, this patient had exploratory laparotomy. Do you see any pain medication opioid administered? No, you do not. That was one of the features that other residents gave me a heads up. Oh, Dr. Miller doesn't like to give opioids. I guess he's concerned about respiratory depression. So that's the other unique thing I noticed about looking back at this anesthesia record. Now, if you look at the PACU vital signs, however, the vital signs look great. And I wasn't making those up. I know you could do that in the paper days. I was not making up those vital signs. The respiratory rate was 16, saturation of 100%. And there's Dr. Miller's famous signature. Those of you who've seen it will recognize it very, very easily. So that's what it was like to do a case with Dr. Miller. Now, I want to speak a little bit about his impact on education programs and those that persist to this very day. One of them was about just the importance of the residency in general to the department. So I have many emails from him that I archived over the years. When he had faculty, we had a faculty retreat in 2004 that I was a junior faculty. I was a pretty prodigious note taker back in those days. So I have many quotes from him about his philosophy of running the department and where the residency fit in. So he would say things like, inspirational things like, our goal is to have the best residency program in the country. Definitely, heard him say that many times. And then at one faculty meeting, I can't remember how this came up or what faculty member must have had a question about something, about what was important or the priorities in the department. So one of his quotes was, the core of this department is the residency, the residency, the residency. Now, thinking back to that brochure that I showed you in 1990 when we had 59 faculty, and thinking back on even the cases that would be at the Parnassus campus, every single case had a resident working on the case. So you can see now how that would make sense, that if every case has a resident, if you have outstanding residents, that's important. Now, Michael, what we have about a third of the cases maybe are done with residents, and the rest with either faculty solo or with nurse anesthetists. And then, so another quote from Dr. Miller, to be the top department in the country, outstanding residents were an absolute necessity. So this is really, so big picture vision was always something that Ron stressed. He did also, at that faculty meeting in 2004, he was talking about principles of how he ran the department. And one of the things he said was he only keeps 3 or 4 principles in mind. He said, I'm no Phi Beta Kappa. So he was referencing back to me. He didn't say his high school or his elementary school grades, but he said, I was no Phi Beta Kappa. So I kept it to few simple principles. Now, interestingly, the first time, so there were never any real residency rankings during Dr. Miller's time as chair. The first time that residency rankings came about was by a company called Doximity, a website, and they modeled it after the US News and World Report style of ranking hospitals and whatnot. And they used surveys from board certified anesthesiologists, alumni satisfaction, board certification rate, alumni publications. So the first time this was published in 2014, we were the top residency. And this, I think, reflects the legacy of Dr. Miller, and when all those years of saying our goal is to be outstanding and having many years of graduates by the time this thing came out, I think that really reflects Dr. Miller's legacy in the residency. Now, interestingly, at the time, what were the other #1 residencies at UCSF besides us? Neurosurgery and radiology were the other programs that were considered the top in the country by this rating system. Dr. Miller was very supportive of the medical student programs. He himself, because he had a degree in pharmacology from UCSF, he had connections with the faculty members in pharmacology. And so earlier on in his time as faculty, he would give half a dozen lectures on various aspects of pharmacology. This is before the curriculum evolved. There used to be a distinct pharmacology course, and Dr. Miller was a regular speaker in that. For a time when we had our anesthesia required clerkship, so which Marty Bogetz was in charge of for many years, Dr. Miller used to meet every group of students that came and talk to them about anesthesia. This particular slide is from the UCSF students who matched into anesthesia in 2006. So this is when Marty, pictured here, was the director of the clerkship. And by this time I was the vice chair for education, Dr. Miller is chair, and we had a champagne toast to the residents who matched that year. Nowadays, so that there were 5 students in this photo. Now up to 20 students are going into anesthesia every year at UCSF. Now, the other part where Dr. Miller had an impact on education was, for those of you who are around in the 1990s, there was a crash in medical students going into anesthesia residency. There was a very prominent Wall Street Journal article from March 1995 that started out with Patrick Kwan, who was a resident a year above me at UCSF. So here's this article. It features, the first 2 words are one of our graduates of our residency, and that he couldn't find a full-time job. They used the word migrant medical worker driving his 1989 Mazda across Northern California. And so this was kind of the harbinger of what would happen shortly in the anesthesia match nationally. So if you go back and look at the NRMP data from the anesthesia match, and I picked a few years before 1995 and then a few years after. So if you look at 1992, so the left part of the left part of the graph is the total positions in the country. And then the orange graph is how many, or the number that filled. So it's pretty stable there. So even that Wall Street Journal article coming out in 1995, that match was already done by the time that article came out. But you can see in 1996, the first year after that Wall Street Journal article, 34% of anesthesia positions were filled in the country. Now, at that time, and then you can see how it's like, it recovered a bit in the subsequent years. During this time, UCSF program always filled. And that's a testament to both Ron Miller and Mark Rosen, who was a residency director at the time. That's remarkable to have that 100% fill rate during this time when the specialty interest is really going downhill. Nowadays, so the last match in the 2025 match, there were 2,100 anesthesia spots. So you can see in 2000, that was about 1,000 positions. So it's about twice as many positions. There were 2 unfilled positions in the entire country last year. That's how things have changed since then. Now, another impact that Dr. Miller had on anesthesia education programs today is the Simulator Center. In 1999, and this part, I'm not sure exactly how he came to the conclusion that we needed to develop a anesthesia patient simulator teaching program. Ron was not known for his facility with technology in any way, shape, or form. I mean, except for Dr. Gropper showed a photo of Dr. Miller with his feet on the desk. If you were looking closely, there was a BlackBerry on his desk. That's the one technology that he was into, his BlackBerry. That's it. So the anesthesia simulator in the year 1999, when he announced to the department that we needed to develop a teaching program using computerized patient simulators, that thing cost $250,000. So in today's dollars, that's like if I went to Michael and said, I have this thing I want to buy for education, it's the equivalent of $450,000. So, so Dr. Miller brought that to the department, saying we need somebody to be, to lead this program and and to figure out how to do with this technology. And that's when I volunteered for that position back in 1999. And then so year 2000, we have our $200,000 simulator. Pictured with Ron is Tina Khan, who was a medical student at the time, who subsequently became a resident in our program. And Tina is now on the board of directors of the American Board of Anesthesiology. So a big circle. And we developed, or we housed this simulator at that time in OR 9 of San Francisco General Hospital. So Sue Carlisle was the chief of anesthesia there at that time. She subsequently became the dean at San Francisco General. So she helped to make sure, she and Ron helped to make sure that we didn't get kicked out. Well, we got kicked out of a couple places, but we always had another landing spot. And we've now been in the same site at San Francisco General for at least 10 years now, 15 years probably in the same spot. And for those of you who are anesthesia residents during this time, you'll recognize at the Moffitt Long, we had Omeda anesthesia machines, except for OR 12, the liver transplant room, because Scott Kelly, bless his heart, with the chief of liver transplant anesthesia, insisted on having a Draeger anesthesia machine in OR 12. And then this must have been, I can't remember, Scott left around 2000 or 99 or 2000. And so the rest of the liver team said that I could have the Draeger anesthesia machine and take it to the simulator center at the General. And so that's the Draeger anesthesia machine that was in OR 12 during Scott Kelly's time as chief. And so the legacy today is simulation is now a required part of residency training. It's in the anesthesia program requirements. You must have simulation training. For a while, it was also part of the American Board of Anesthesiologists' Maidens of Certification. It is as a requirement. It is still an option used by many MOCA participants, but that's the legacy. We were one of the first in the country at that time in 2000 to have a computerized patient simulator, and that was Ron's influence. Now, another legacy of Ron Miller, and then Judith Hellman alluded to this a little bit, was this idea of a residency for to develop physician scientists. And in anesthesiology in the year 2006, there were a couple editorials, one by Deborah Schwinn, about a wake-up call for anesthesiology physician scientists. And after this meeting, Dr. Miller went to meetings of the Morton Society, which is this kind of a secret society of self-declared best anesthesia, academic anesthesia programs, which Dr. Gropper is a part of still to this day. Anyway, so Dr. Miller discussed this with the Morton Society programs and came to the conclusion that yes, we needed a fast track research residency to develop anesthesia physician scientists. And his nickname for this was 2+2. He ignored the internship, which I had to add in the 1. You have to do the internship first and then 2+2. And so my role was helping to collate a big picture thought to an actionable plan that could be submitted for approval. And this is just what we originally submitted. It's now called, well, at the time we called it the Research Scholars Track, and then as Judith Hellman pointed out, it's now called AIR, or Intensive Research Residency. Now, it wasn't necessarily Dr. Miller's idea to have a critical care track, but there was, in that idea of experimentation or program innovation, that Dr. Miller was very supportive of having a fast track into critical care trained anesthesiologists. Again, I think it reflects the concept of perioperative medicine, which is very important to him. My role was getting this approved by both the ACGME Residency Review Committee. Fortunately, at the time, we had an in with Neal Cohen, who was a member of that committee. Initially, and then of course, the American Board of Anesthesiology, they both had to approve it. And when we first asked one, they said, well, have the ABA approve it first. That's what the RSC said. And the ABA said, well, no, have the RSC approve it first, then we'll look at it. And so back and forth. But that was my role, was working through administrative red tape with those organizations. And we were ultimately approved in 07 and 08. And it did take till subsequent matches when he was no longer chair that we actually matched our first candidates for those. But it was Dr. Miller's legacy that he came to the department with that idea. We have to do this. We have to keep our program, he said the status quo is a formula for decline. We must be innovating, including in education. Now, several people have mentioned his textbook legacy, and Neal even mentioned that he did an interview for the Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology. I've been to the Wood Library Museum. It's in the ASA headquarters, and they have all sorts of anesthesia textbooks. And so when I was there a few years ago, I looked in and I figured there must be a whole bunch of Miller's anesthesia, and certainly there were. They were there. And one thing Dr. Miller pointed out to me, if you see in the second row, it goes from anesthesia to Miller's anesthesia. And Dr. Miller pointed out to me several times as we worked together on 2 editions of the Basics of Anesthesia, he said, I never wanted my name on those books. I never asked for my name on those books, that the publisher wanted to do it and they thought it would help sell. So he begrudgingly did that. And likewise, Basics also had its smaller, the book is thinner, but that makes it, you don't get a muscle strain carrying Basics of Anesthesia. And so that's also at the Wood Library. Now, the textbook legacy, I guess the editions of the books that Dr. Miller last worked on. So with me, it was for the 7th edition of Basics of Anesthesia. And it wasn't called Miller's Basics, he would not have allowed that back then. And also he did a book with Lorraine Sadralis, one of the graduates of our program also, called Miller's Anesthesia Review. These came out simultaneously in 2017. And so these were the last books that Ron directly worked on with Lorraine and myself. Lorraine's photo is not on the cover, but that's what Lorraine looks like. I think she's on the Zoom. These textbooks had a very nice review. And I can tell you that Michael and I are both proud to be part of the Miller textbook legacy. This is the ASA in 2022, the Elsevier booth. And so we're each holding our legacy of the Ron Miller textbook. Now, a few people have mentioned golf. One of my hobbies I started medical school was golf. And so when I started in the department, we all knew that Dr. Miller was an avid golfer. We used to have this tournament called the Copper Kettle Classic. And this was a scramble format. So you didn't have to actually play golf to participate. Usually in each foursome, there was one person who actually played golf regularly. And then the rest have, ranged from I've heard of golf to, occasionally they'll play. In this photo, this is from about 1996, Dr. Miller and Dr. Hamilton were paired up together. So that's Alvin Wong and I think Mark Moore in that foursome. And so they got to play with the 2 previous chairs of the anesthesia department. This looks to be at Lincoln Park in San Francisco, just based on the amount of fog that was there. Now, interestingly, after Dr. Miller stepped down his chair, my emails back and forth with him became much more reflective about just various things. It's sort of the equivalent of what used to happen when you'd have a meeting with him for an hour, and I mentioned that's 40 minutes of other stuff. So my emails about, we're working on the book and this thing, they would, often meander into other topics. One of them was golf. And so one year, I think this is roughly 2012, a few years after he stepped down his chair, I was in Maui. And he mentioned that he used to have a condo in Maui. So I sent him a photo from the course I played, Wailea Golf Course. And he said, he sent me back this, actually he sent quite a long email. I'm gonna, for Shelley and Laura, this actually was quite personal. He starts off with, I promise not to fill your computer with my emails. Owning that condo in Hawaii was associated with some of the most happy times of my life. Even though we were renting it, all owners had a small closet that remained locked. On several occasions, we came to the condo without much planning. We would say, let's go to Hawaii next week. And no luggage. And the Polo Beach staff picked us up filled our refrigerator with food. Our daughters were young and thought it was wonderful. It was pure relaxation. The big book actually started there along with a couple of my NIH grants. I'd play golf first thing in the morning, finished at 11, fun with the kids till about 2 p.m., and then working at the pool until 6 p.m. It was so easy, I could not imagine how it could be better. So those were some of the, I don't know if he ever talked to you about that or reflected that with, you, Shelley and Laura, but those are the kind of things that would, come out in some of Ron's meandering emails brought on by, things like this photo of my vacation in Maui. For several times, about half a dozen times, he took me to play at the San Francisco Golf Club. We used to have department events there toward the latter half of his time as chair. The first time I played there, again, talk about an intimidating experience. I think the first time I played there, I go to the locker room, change into your golf shoes, and I look up, and yes, there's Charles Schwab's locker. And I look to my right, and there's George Shultz, former Secretary of State. George Shultz's locker was on the other side. So those are the kind of people that were playing at that golf club. So I know that he took a lot of joy in golf. Another quote he told me was that golf for him was a lifelong connection with serenity. And so he, he always enjoyed talking about golf with me. This is the last time I saw Dr. Miller in person. This was in November of 2022. I think this was instigated by Gail Miller, called Karen Bogetz. And then through Marty's workings, we arranged to have lunch. I think it was a few weeks before Thanksgiving in November 2022. So that's the last time I saw Dr. Miller in person. But like many others, I was very grateful to Dr. Miller for all he's done for my career. I feel privileged to have gotten to work with him and to honor his legacy with the textbook. So thank you very much.
All right, our last sort of formal presentation coming up, and then we'll have some time for some informal comments from various interested parties in the audience. I want to introduce Dr. Romain Pirracchio. Romain is a professor of anesthesia, I think professor of biostatistics in Berkeley as well, the executive vice chair of the department, and the chief of service at San Francisco General. I think it's a great example of the international reputation that Ron had built in the department. I think is what attracted Romain to come to San Francisco and spend 2 different sabbaticals as well, and eventually now has moved here permanently along with his family. He's been incredibly successful as a leader and as a researcher, and he is also the Ronald D. Miller Distinguished Professor of Anesthesia. And I know I have many of you in the audience to thank for contributing to that professorship. So, Romain.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. It definitely means a lot. And it's a tremendous honor, of course, to be here and to conclude this afternoon full of emotion and of probably the greatest innovation that we've seen in our specialty over the past couple of decades. So Dr. Miller was a true giant in the field of anesthesia. I think, after all the words we've heard, everybody's definitely convinced of that. And we were before this symposium, of course. And after all the fantastic tributes that we've heard, I'd just like to take a few minutes to express the impact for me of being the Ronald D. Miller Professor and how it really impacted my life personally, professionally, and of course, from a scientific standpoint. And if I may, I wanted to start with a few words about my personal journey. Life is paved with milestones, some that we choose and some that just find us. And I want to tell you a little bit about how the dots connected for me. So I was born and raised in Paris, did my medical training in Paris, did my residency in Paris as well. And after, I think, the first couple of weeks as a resident in anesthesia and critical care, I decided to use the money I didn't have to buy 2 books. The first one is the red one here, called Anesthesia Réanimation Chirurgicale in proper French, which stands for Anesthesia and Surgical Critical Care. Written by Kamran Sami, was a very well-renowned professor of anesthesia in France. And the second one, of course, was the Miller's Anesthesia. I started reading these books, and what really was fascinating to me from the first page to the last one was how deep these 2 books were going into what makes our specialty so special. The physiology, the pharmacology, the deep understanding of the body and how we interact with it when we're performing anesthesia and when we're treating our patients for a critical illness, for pain, for periop their periop phase. These two books quickly became my nightstand staples, but I had no idea at that time that those two books would concurrently pave my way with milestones towards the United States, the Bay Area, San Francisco, and UCSF. I remember sitting down with Professor Sami probably during the first year of my residency. He was the first one to, again, sit down with me and start talking to me not about physiology or anesthesia or the usual topic, but talking to me about the importance of moving abroad, learning about different experience, different practices, different healthcare system, getting to know and to understand how people are practicing around the world. That was really eye-opening to me. And I could tell from the first time that he was actually speaking from heart and also speaking from personal experience, because he did spend a lot of time at UCSF. UCSF seemed very far away from me at that time. Young resident, born and raised in Paris. But immediately it was like, UCSF, wait a minute. Isn't that the place where there is a department of anesthesia shared by Dr. Miller? And the dots started to connect at that time for me. And I think from that point on, I started thinking about connecting my experience in Paris with the Bay Area. It took some time though. And I continued my training, started working as an anesthesiologist, and getting to know different people that really impacted my career. I met some people who actually suggested that I go back to science, do an MPH, and then a PhD in biostatistics, which I did. And at the end of my PhD advisor at that time asked me to do a postdoc. She was very connected with Harvard. And she wanted me to go to work with Professor Hernan, Professor Jamie Robbins, who are giants in the field of applied biostatistics. And she also mentioned that she was connected to California, to Berkeley, in fact. And coming from Paris, the weather in Boston is not so much appealing. So we decided to move to the Bay Area. Here we are with my family, my first son, in Berkeley. And really, for real, it's not before settling in Berkeley, after probably a couple of weeks there, that I realized that UCSF is in fact right across the Bay Bridge. So the dots were connecting again here. But I was not connected to UCSF at that time. And to be quite frank, I was leaving with the impression that is still very much ingrained, by the way, in a lot of the with a lot of the doctors in Europe, that it's just impossible to come and practice medicine in the US for a foreignly trained doctor. But I still, managed to connect with people from UCSF, mainly researchers, connect with the trauma team over at the General. We started a research project together. And by the end of my postdoc, I remember we are hosting a reception in the Department of Biostatistics at UC Berkeley. And I was talking with some folks from UCSF, and they tell me about the so-called 2113 pathway, which is the license that Neal knows very well, that the Medical Board of California offers to doctors that want to come and practice in California in an academic institution under a visiting status. With that in mind, when I went back to France, but I was really certain that I wanted to take a chance and try to come back and work at UCSF. I connected with Dr. Gropper. Dr. Jim Marks was the chief of anesthesia at the General at that time, and they welcomed me at UCSF as a visiting associate professor with my clinical commitment at ZSFG. The 2 years that I spent at the General and at UCSF from 2015 to 2017 were really transformative to me. Well, the first thing that was transformative is that I met Shelley Mitchell here with someone else, I think, on the same picture, right? The twins, as we call them. And it took me a little while to understand that Shelley Mitchell was also Shelley Miller, Dr. Miller's daughter. And the dots were connecting again. They were starting to accumulate at this point in time. I moved back to Paris, and in 2018, I had the opportunity to come back here as a faculty in the department and the chief of anesthesia at San Francisco General. And shortly after, I received what was, still is, and will ever be the greatest honor of my professional life, the Ronald D. Miller Endowed Professorship. After receiving this honor, I started reading everything I could find about Dr. Miller's legacy and contribution to the field of anesthesia. And of course, this legacy is immense. We've heard about his contribution throughout this day. Of course, it goes way beyond the Miller's anesthesia. It goes way beyond being the chair of a premier academic department of anesthesia. It encompasses being an extremely accomplished researcher in important fields such as applied physiology, pharmacology, safety in anesthesia, really transforming, as we heard from Manny, training and education for a specialty, which I think has been instrumental, as you know, the numbers showed from the residency and the match. It really helped our specialty remaining an academic specialty and extremely attractive to our trainees. But I also realized, which makes a lot of sense, that Miller is an eponym in anesthesia. And if you look at this paper that I found a couple of weeks ago, we have the Trendelenburg, we have the Apgar, we have the Yankauer, and we have the Miller. So Miller, this name, is part of the identity of anesthesia nowadays. So with this legacy in mind, becoming the Ronald D. Miller Professor really meant a lot for me. And I have to say that, with the support of Dr. Gropper and the research leadership in the department, we're able to build something that I think we can be very proud of. A very unique infrastructure in our department, maybe the only one in the country, to research, study data science in a way that will, I think, advance the field of anesthesia and critical care, peri-op medicine and pain in a unique fashion. Certainly, joining UCSF was a milestone in my career, but becoming the Ronald D. Miller Professor was really a turning point in my research. It was immensely catalytic. It really gave me the footing, both from an institutional standpoint, a national standpoint, an international standpoint, to start building something that I hope will be lasting. And just to share with you a few examples of that, we've been able to create the Epoch AI Lab, which bridges UCSF and UC Berkeley. This lab was actually one of the very first to bridge UCSF and UC Berkeley and have like a common research sort of enterprise between the two sites, to the point where when a bigger program was created to formally join the two universities called Computational and Precision Health, I had the chance to be asked to be one of the executive leader for this group, because we had the experience of bringing the two universities together. So the Epoch AI Lab is developing clinical AI and clinical decision support tools to help physicians making better decisions in real time for the most acute patients. We are doing that by bringing the best talents, and every single year we're able to bring 10 to 15 students to our lab, postgraduate students, PhD, postdocs, fellows. We're doing that with the support of virtually all the agencies, NIH, FDA, PCORI, DOD, and private funders as well. And in less than 8 years now, we've been able to publish our research in top-tier journals like JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, Digital Health, and others. This definitely wouldn't have been possible without the professorship and without the name that gives the stature to our lab. The other thing that we're able to do in the department, with again the support of Dr. Gropper and Dr. Hellman, is the creation of the data science core in the department. And the goal was really here to use a model whereby we dismantle completely the silos between all the different research groups, in this case in data science, in the lab, to bring them all together and create the necessary cross-pollination and collaboration between those researchers. We're able to do that by creating a unique infrastructure with some computing infrastructure in the department, and also with the creation of a unique data capturing pipeline that we're very proud to launch probably early in 2026 at San Francisco General, and that will give us the opportunity to capture all the signals, all the information for all our acute care patients and our trauma patients, with the goal of offering the best possible care to our most vulnerable patients at the General. This data science core, the support that we received from the Ronald D. Miller Professorship and from the department, has been instrumental and has given us the opportunity to attract the best talent in data science and in anesthesia. I think as a result of that, we've been able to position the department as a leader in the field of data science and clinical AI, nationally and internationally. And again, on a personal note, for better or worse, in the era of social networks, when you publish a paper, even for the ones you're not proud of, you receive a lot of congratulations from people on social medias, right? I can share with you that receiving the Ronald D. Miller Professorship has resulted in a real immense amount of congratulation from the entire world. And this made me realize how this name was something for the entire anesthesia community in the entire world. Of course, this comes with responsibilities, but I think it's the most important part of it. And that's what I really want to take away. Being the inaugural Ronald D. Miller Professor is the responsibility to ask the hard questions, never stick to the simple ones, to challenge orthodoxy, to really train and educate with intention. And I think the most important part to me, especially now in these challenging times, to carry forward the vision of academic anesthesia. This is really our identity. And I think with that in mind, we're safe for the future. His legacy is really deeply ingrained in the department. You've heard about many people, and I can tell you that I see this legacy in virtually everyone in the department, in every single one of our missions, caring our patient, educating, researching. And it's really an immense honor for me to continue this journey in his name. Thank you.
Thank you, Romain. I think it's a great way to celebrate the legacy and the future of the department, and I think it's in good hands. All right, so we now have opportunity to hear from those not in the formal program. I know there's a couple that I've already communicated with, and I'm looking at you, George Gregory, and I'm looking at Marty Bogetz, wherever Marty is, somewhere, and Dennis Fisher. All right, so let's start as a matter of seniority with George. Well, the food's not till 5, so it doesn't really matter. Oh.
Thank you for giving me the honor of doing this. He asked me to say a few words, and I wrote them on this so that I won't go over. I met Ron, and I'm the only one here who was a resident with Ron. So I met him on the first day of residency, and residency was 2 years then. There were 12 of us who were residents compared to what you have now. There were 12 faculty compared to what you have now. And it was an interesting place to work because it was so close. Everybody knew each other and knew each other well. And out of that residency came Bob Stoulding, Bob Hickey, Cedric Bainton, myself, and 3 or 4 people, including John Wade from Canada. And out of that came 3 or 4 chairs of departments, 2 deans, and a person who was in charge of medicine for the province of in Canada. So that was a very productive. The rest of us didn't do much, but they did a lot. So, but Ron and I were residents together, and then he went off to Vietnam, which I think was one of the things that was very helpful to the world. Because if you read those 2 papers that were in here, listed in here, that's the foundation of a modern treatment of massive blood loss. And it all came from Ron and what he was doing there to take care of patients and make them better and make them survive, because the mortality was great in patients who were losing a lot of blood before that. And he changed that and was able to do that. And then he came back to be on the faculty here and did all the things that you've seen with his muscle relaxants and all those other studies that he's done. So he established really doing good work in pharmacology in the Department of Anesthesia. And it expanded from there, including Dennis sitting back there, who worked with Ron and developed the things that Dennis developed. And it came from Ron. I mean, it came from his association with Ron. And that story that you heard about the explosive that was in this person there, Ron volunteered because he believed that was the right thing to do. And I think one of the things that impressed me with Ron for my whole career with him was that he wanted to do the right thing. The right thing, and he did it. And he set out to do it, and he figured out how to do it. Sometimes it would take him a little while, but he would figure out how to do it and how to do it well. And I think you've seen the results of all of that. And then he became the chair of the department. And I mean, you've heard all the things that he's done, but he advanced patient care at UCSF. He advanced research. There was no gene doctoring going on, as I call it, yet prior to the time that Ron was chair. He realized that the future of anesthesia research had to involve genes and gene structures and how things worked, and got it to work. With this, I think we've improved anesthesia and improved the care of patients. And I think it's going to continue, and Mike's doing a great job of doing that. So I guess to end this, I'd say the most important thing to me was that Ron was my friend and was my friend for a lot of years. And I could count on him for being honest with me, telling me when I was doing things right, letting me do things, letting me work in the newborn intensive care unit for all of those years and basically do neonatology. There isn't anybody else in the country who would have allowed me to do that. They just would not have done that, but he did. He and Bill Hamilton did that. They let me go up there. And I was supposed to go for a year. I spent 45 up there. So it was great. So Ron, I don't know where you are right now, but wherever it is, I hope you're having a hell of a good time.
All right, let's see. Dennis, you said you wanted to say a few words. Who's going to be next after that? Oh, perfect. Yeah, you can just do that. Perfect.
So, great.
I came to UCSF in 1980. Right here. I have to swallow it.
Okay, all right. They can hear it on Zoom.
Well, okay. There we go. I came to UCSF in 1980. And I profited a lot. Mom's chair, very careful. My friends in other institutions who somehow tried. Most of my career, two or three. Vicky, who wanted me to operate before, no, but one of my NIH study set. And anyone who knows about how study set can work, somebody from your institution, your department, not supposed to be in the room. Well, I sort of got the started with you, and then Ron typed up he was chair. And he was asked to leave, but I think he did a little movie. I remember the video. So I got some very appreciative. Early in my career, Larry said he was there in college. And Ron encouraged Larry to involve him as a reviewer. And then when the first group of associate editors was selected, part of that group was the youngest associate editor, and then became the youngest editor. So, Ron got me started on that. Mike Gropper mentioned at the beginning that he was told not to write chapters on his part here. I did a good job trying to protect myself from writing chapters. And Ron came to me and said, "You write 2 chapters for the second edition of Anesthesia." I said, "Well, Ron, I'm not going to write computers. I wrote but I was willing to take on chapters. I knew very little statistics. I had no formal statistics. Took on that chapter. I already knew I heard a lot of statistics. It worked out really well for me because I left UCSF in 2000. I started a career basically in statistician. And I don't think that would happen on pushing me to write that chapter. Very painful task writing something like that, but it also was very powerful. When the book was released, Larry said he was still theology. Larry called me, he wrote me a 10-page letter saying, "I read your chapter, it's very influential on how I manage the trial." And I found 2 mistakes in the chapter. We actually gone through such careful detail, we found little subtle things that I had missed. So the next version is this. So Ron helped me. One final comment, Marty Bogetz told me. Once we moved on top of my head in the door, and custom on out. And once the audience didn't have it. Apparently Ron was respecting the fact that I don't know why that happened, but thank you. We can talk about it.
Thank you, Dennis. Anyone else? How did I know that was going to happen?
No, I've got it. I come from a background of people believe that people live on music. So I just have to and the and even at space, he told us but when they went to do diagnostic, weightlessness patients, the people move away. And he was asked to figure out a way to keep people close. I thought, I had another picture. And here,
And because of that, stretched. It's really good. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I have a different story. But what was Weekend at Bernie's? So this is a movie that I don't know why. Family ordinary. Buy it. And it's two deadbeats in this company, and you know, they get invited to their boss's mansion on the beach, and they arrive early and find them dead. And then before they can hide them, guests start arriving. And they put them on the couch, and the guests come up and talk to them and interact with them, and they don't say, they were really dead. So in one part of the movie, they move his arms up it to answer questions, and he said it reminded him of countless meetings. And just watching all these other people in the meeting, sitting there like burning. He couldn't tell if he was dead, if they were dead or alive. And a lot of them just were like puppets. He didn't like yes people. He was a believer in that our success was his success. He didn't have to achieve it. But he was smart enough to know that he was successful. People around him. He had a sense of humor. He always participated in the measures we had for granted. And one of the things that was very practical, we had a team, developed a scheme to recognize teaching excellence, financial incentives, and those of us that didn't qualify complained that it was just a popularity contest. What are you saying? Be more popular. You relish getting faculty to put themselves in a poor box by saying, well, I can't get this off this time I can. And you would say, I understand. Let me know what I can do. Okay. And again, I would just encourage people to take time to think about the memories of them and reflect on them.
All right, pardon me? It is 5 o'clock exactly. Thank you. And we're gonna next go out into the lobby. But before that, I want to thank the people who put this event on. Olivia Bratko in the back did a tremendous amount of work. Hannah Fairbanks here in the front, Susan Fernandez, Morgan Ahern, who was going to be here, but her car broke down this morning, so she wasn't able to make it, and Carol Schreibman and Ed Matthews running the audiovisuals. Thank you all. This really does take a team, and I'm grateful to all of you. So let's go out to the lobby and catch up.